Welcome to the SmartQA Musings. And this week, an interesting one, hopefully like the others. This is about smart probes versus test cases. What is it? We all know about test cases. We all use that as a standard term. Is it good enough? We'll see some interesting things in that context. Let me just set the context before we continue on into the bit of a discussion and share some interesting thoughts. After all, SmartQA Musings is a flurry of interesting thoughts. Now, what are test cases? I'm not looking at any pedagogic definition, but simply it means that probably there is a set of inputs for which we expect some output. And what we do is to execute this in some disciplined manner. We also sometimes use the word of scenarios. And if you want to look at what they mean, this is probably the simplistic definition. A collection, a set of test cases, which is primarily focused on validating a specific behavior. So a well-organized test suite would consist of a set of scenarios, some of which are for some feature or a flow or a requirement organized by the entity, so to speak. And within those scenarios, we might have a bunch of specific test cases, which are all similar for every particular scenario. And subsequently, how we execute it, we could automate it, we could do it, and so on. The question here is, we normally live in the world of test cases and scenarios. And the question, therefore, is, hey, is that good enough? That's what we're going to talk about. Now, before we get there, let's understand a little bit as to what they really imply. So test cases and scenarios more often are very specific. What does that mean? It means it has a very clear set of inputs and expected outputs, and they're normally focused on validating a particular entity, which be like a feature or a flow or a requirement. So they are indeed very specific. They're not as generic, right? And therefore, the question here is it good enough? And the normal answer would be not really. And the question is, what more? And then the answer turns out to be, maybe we need to do some ad hoc, maybe we need to explore, maybe we need to go beyond the bounds of what is disciplined. And normally we associate disciplined testing with some written or designed test cases. So is that all it is? And my take on this is it's not really true. So what do we mean by this statement? And that is where the idea of probes come in, and that's what I'm going to look at. The idea of smart probes. Of course, in some of the earlier webcasts, I have probably talked about what is the meaning of a probe and what it is, etc. And we will dwell upon it a little bit, and then more than anything else, compare it with what we know as test cases. Now let's look at it from a probe perspective, right? So probe means what? I inject something, I use a probe to observe something, and then find out if it's good, right, wrong, bad, good. So one of the easiest ways to think about a probe, which I'm going to call as a first level probe, is, hey, I have a set of inputs, I'm expecting some outputs. So if I connect this and this is a line, and this box is the system under test, your application, your product, your module, your feature, however you may want to think, system under test or entity under test. So the first level probe is, a probe is nothing but a set of inputs that I inject into the system, maybe via the UI, maybe via the API, maybe in whatever form or fashion. And then the system takes these inputs, executes some pieces of lines of code, and it gives you some output. And therefore, this line simply means it traverses certain parts of code. And therefore, what is it? That's something that we know. It's test case. So this single line, a dotted one in this particular case, is a specific test, is a test case to validate a specific situation. So if you say, hey, here is what I have as payment. So now I am going to make a payment using my credit card for the items that I purchased. and therefore I have to pay 400 rupees, and therefore I choose credit card. I supply some information related to the credit card and the amount, and if the state of the credit card is it is valid, it is not expired, it has money, it is not blocked, then the transaction may go through and the expected result is a successful payment. So the inputs would be credit card details like number, name, your CVC, whatever, the code, and internal aspects like card is not expired. All these are inputs, and the amount which we're adding to it and the expected is a successful transaction, of course, after maybe receiving a OTP and stuff like that, right? So if I had a slightly different test case to validate another situation, I want to be able to validate it with a card which has maxed out its limit. So maybe this is you might call as a negative test case, and therefore I'm just showing it another way. So I'm just trying to show you that, hey, first level probes are very straightforward, what we know as test cases, and the second level probe is just a combination. So you might say, I have different situations. I'm paying 400 rupees. I'm paying 4 lakh rupees, because 4 lakh rupees may be my maximum amount of money that I can possibly spend on my card. So maybe I've got different values, but the scenario is the same. What does the scenario say? You must be able to successfully pay. So scenario typically means a particular output, correct? And that's what this is. And therefore, the first one may be the lower boundary of 400, and this one may be a higher boundary of 4 lakh and stuff like that. By the same token, expanding the same idea, maybe the card is, the card is expired, or the card is maxed out, or whatever, or blocked, for example. Another scenario, maybe another negative kind of a scenario. So now what are we trying to do? Am I just confusing you with a word called probe, but I'm still talking the same language? Up till now, it seems like, isn't it? That there is something called test case, which is straightforward, just a series of inputs, a specific thing to check for, and select scenario seems to just be a collection. So, okay, these are the two kinds of probes that we seem to know and we practice more often. But you see, there are 4 other kinds of probes that we will talk about. And a combination of all these is what makes it interesting, because then they become fundamentally more smarter. And I'll tell you at the closing as to why that probably is. Now, what's a third kind of a probe? Now, you might say, hey, you know what? I can't tell you all the time it is specific. Here is what the inputs are, and this is what you're expecting. I could probably state it as, I want you to validate such that it meets the criteria 1. And I want you to ensure that it meets the criteria 2. Now, the criteria could be written in many ways. You could say it's an acceptance criteria for user story. I might call it cleanliness criteria for the entity. So what is the criteria? It is basically saying, this is what I expect. It could be a functional criteria. It could be a non-functional attribute related criteria. And therefore, if I express my probe as an objective, what kind of objective? That I want to do something. I want to do something such that I validate that this criteria is met. I may not be able to exactly state the actions, because remember, when we write a test case or a scenario, most of the time we also have the associated procedure, which might be a series of steps, which is what we end up probably automating, right? We automate those steps. Sometimes it may be harder to express it as a series of steps. It may be easier to express it as a criteria. So if I now look at the entire thought process as probing, then I could say maybe I could express it in something beyond the test case and scenarios as a criteria. And therefore, what do I do? Given a particular criteria, I will figure out how to do. So that's a higher level of probe. What's the difference? I'm trying to be a little more generic. Can I be specific? Yes, you can. If you say, look for this particular criteria in this particular requirement, meaning in that entity or user story. Or it could be, look for this criteria to be satisfied as a part of the performance test. So if your criteria is the response time at any of these screens to refresh should not exceed more than a second, or all the APIs should return within X amount of milliseconds. So there could be certain generic criteria that could be applicable for larger parts of the system, or there could be some specific criteria that could be. But the difference is it is not stated as a series of actions. If I use the same token and I move this little inside, I state it as issues to look for, not criteria to meet, but I still have the idea that I'm not exactly stating how to do. I'm not writing down the action. So that is like a fourth level probe, because now I'm saying, look, we can devise probes which are very specific, which tell you clearly how to do. We can extend it to be able to state an objective either in terms of a criteria or an issue, and help you figure out how to go after, how to come up with these actions. What is the advantage? We are not boxed into the idea that I must be able to think in terms of only inputs and actions, but we can also look at it from objectives and outcomes and issues, which could be external objectives as criteria, or test objectives as potential issues to look forward to finding. The different shapes I put as triangle, etc., represent different types of issues, right? One of them may relate to, let's say, timeout related issue. Another one may relate to performance related. Another one may relate to a specific behavioral issue for a particular entity, right? That in this case, even though the card is not expired, maybe it is still refusing my transaction. And then you have to go find out as to why that may be. And you're trying to find out if there's a potential malfunction, right? So now extending this idea, I'm not neither on the outside, neither on the inside as a criteria, but I'm looking around all around. What does it mean? It means, look, the fifth level kind of a probe is not to tell you how to do, or even in some sense what to do, maybe meaning what to look for as an objective or an issue, but only give you suggestions. So what do I mean by that? If I'm saying, you know what, okay, in this kind of a situation, you may want to look at memory consumption. You may want to look at how much of resources are being consumed, because it is a cloud system. If it is consuming too much resources, it's going to be costly. Or you might want to say, okay, if this particular user in this particular situation uses it, he would find it or she would find it very difficult. So there could be different points of view which are kind of expressed as a series of eyes. Could be from user point of view, environment point of view, interaction point of view. What does interaction mean? Oh, this one could affect that. So the idea of looking at it using the notion of directions or point of view and expressing that as probes are also a higher level notion of scenarios and test cases, right? Or what we conventionally know as test cases. So how does this help? It does not tell you what to do. It gives you direction. So how could I express it? That is where a smart checklist will come in handy. So instead of being boxed into a thinking that to validate, I need to think in terms of cases and scenarios which are specific, which have clear set of instructions and steps, which have a clear set of inputs and potentially expected outputs, which can be constraining, which is a good start, but which can be constraining simply because of the fact that there could be many, many ways by which I could find issues which could be valuable. And that is when the third and fourth and level and fifth level probe came in. Is there anything more? Is the next question. And the last and the final one is a slightly different one. Now, what does it tell you? I'm not even going to give you a direction. I am probably going to give you ideas. So what's the difference between the previous and the current one? It simply means that there could be different points that you might want to consider. You might think about it in terms of, so normally when we actually start testing, I'm quite sure you can relate to this, that you are not just doing the act. While doing the act, you notice something. You say, this is behaving this way. This could affect that. Or what happens if this connection broke? Or what happens if that particular response was slow? What happens if this database, is temporarily down? What happens if access permission is set, incorrectly set? What happens if this configuration is changed a little bit? So we are looking at multiple pieces at the same time, and in the process you are trying to jot down and say, I need to figure out this. So it's not exactly clear how, and that's why I call it test ideas. And these test ideas are not even a direction, because they are in a way connecting various elements and then throwing you some idea and say, maybe you should look at this. How? We'll figure it out. So the central notion of probe is, since I am looking at it in a very open-minded fashion as in terms of probe, I need a mechanism of thinking and doing which allows me to be open. I'm not as boxed up as in terms of specific test cases and scenarios. So if I kind of give a better word to it, which is a superset, and call it probes, then test cases and test scenarios form the bases, the initial levels of level 1 and 2 of these probes, and the upper level, which are more generic in nature, help us to be a little more open-minded, and I can express them as interesting smart checks, which to me is a takeaway from the checklist. But the checklist is very compliance-oriented, whereas smart list checks is an extension of the typical checklist, where the focus is on helping you think, not force you to do or control you to do, right? And that's what that is all about. So now, how do I summarize this entire idea of probes and the notion of smart probes? This is how I will do it. So I'll think about smart probes as a beautiful combination of all these things that we discussed in a very nice layered fashion. So the first and second level, I have scenarios and cases, which are very specific. I mean specific as in terms of clear set of inputs and outputs, specific actions to do, and that is why I think they're extremely amenable to automating, right? In the conventional automated mechanisms that we know of today. Now, when we get to the next level, what are we doing here? We're stating it as saying, please ensure that this criteria is met. We're not telling how, but we're trying to set up, kind of say, look, it is not the activity now or the action as we called it, it is the goal or the outcome that you have to meet. And we talked about the outcomes can be two variations. One is in terms of user-centered criteria or system-centered issues. So what's the difference between these two? This difference is you're stating it from the user's perspective. You're looking at this from the system's perspective, issues to seek. But remember, this is also goal to meet, right? It is specific in terms of the issues. It is not specific in terms of where. But it can also be made specific if you want to, by saying, hey, I want you to look for this particular kind of an issue in this particular module or feature or flow or whatever. But I can also write it as, look for these kinds of issues and help you think. Because ultimately, probing is an expansive idea, because testing by itself is unbounded. There is no limit as to what you cannot do. We are only limited by the time and the effort we have, because we all have specific timelines. So I cannot be testing for a very long time. But then I should not constrain my thinking. So 3 and 4 represent a goal orientation. The fifth idea of probe is to say, look, I'm not going to tell you the goal nor the action, but I might give you an indicative direction. It's like saying, okay, maybe you want to go along this direction. What does it really mean? You're suggesting. So you're suggesting in these kinds of situations, you may want to look at the deployment and how it is deployed, and therefore find out. Or you may want to say, okay, if the particular transaction is supposed to be very secure, then some of the things that you may want to think is data encrypted and transferred. Is application level access control set in place? Is the data, for example, encrypted and stored? Is certain actions only supposed to be done within a certain time? Otherwise, it becomes insecure. Or in certain cases, you might want to do two-factor authentication. So all these are directions. They're not telling you, please do it, right? And therefore, it definitely becomes generic. And finally, I can't even tell you what to do. But if I were to think about it and say, you know what? Maybe you want to keep this in mind. Maybe you want to think along these lines. And therefore, the ideas are more of enablement and they are generic. So composition of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 styles of thinking, the first two which results in a very clear test asset. But remember, 3, 4, 5 are also test assets, but they may be written not in the typical test case and test scenario style. That's why the idea of a smart checks and a smart checklist becomes handy. And therefore, these 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 help us become totally unbounded. And therefore, allows us to be more smarter in terms of how we look at the act of bug finding, not bound or be compliant, right? We are much more freer. We can be far more doing it. And while we are executing, like all of us, I'm sure I have experience, you are discovering interesting issues to look for, you're discovering interesting directions to check, and you blossom new ideas that you want to try, and you kind of suddenly say, these criteria are important that I missed. And that's how it kind of rolls. And therefore, remember, it is not ad hoc anymore. It is brilliantly exploratory at best, right? And that's why I call it as immersive sessions, because you're terribly immersed in the act, and therefore that blossoms the idea. And the chances of us, therefore, not being bound by what is written and still be able to write it as criteria, issues, directions in this thing in a one-liner helps us to do a far better job. And that is why I call it as smart probes. So these, I think, just to summarize, these, I think we understand typical test cases as what we call, whereas these is what I typically refer to as smart checks, because the way you write them is possibly simply one-liners. And the criteria or the issues could be written at a system level or at an entity level. Now, for example, if you're doing, let's say, for example, a security test using OWASP standards, they are really, the 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if you really look at this OWASP standard and ask, okay, I'm looking at, the web security stuff and evaluation, and I tell you, here are things that you might want to consider and keep. Basically, they're telling you 3, 4, 5, and 6. They're not telling you very specifically all the time, but they're giving you ideas. They're looking forward. They're saying these issues, you be careful. These criteria you should meet. And sometimes some of the aspects will give you some ideas and so on. So that particular standard in a slightly twisted form will become a smart check. Right? It may not always turn out to be specific scenarios and stuff. And that's a pretty interesting shift in our mindset as to how we look. So we have been, as a community, we're reasonably conditioned into evaluation as an act of doing, of an act of execution, of an act of designing scenarios and cases which are documented in a certain form and fashion, which we run, which is not a problem. I think it's necessary to have a certain degree in order and discipline, certain stuff to be able to think a priori and keep, but we don't have to be limited by that. So if we expand our thinking in terms of saying, look, I am probing, then I expand my idea to think of it as probes, which can extend beyond this 1 and 2 into all the other ones, and be able to write it in a fashion which is a one-liner if you're writing it. Or if you're creative, you can probably express some of these things as an interesting mind map, and some of these things could be fairly generic. And that's when I think we get a lot more value for what we do. And remember, some of these ideas, some of these 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of an ideas of smart probes could actually be leverageable entities. That means they could be reused across many projects. what would be, let's say, an example of a simple idea would be like, say, hey, I have got workflows to be tested. I have got certain reports to be checked. I've got certain graphs and stuff that with my software to be tested. I've got certain payments to be done. I've got some registration to be done. So now remember, these kinds of things are fairly common across many, many software. So why do we end up writing specific test cases every time when we could express some of these as a more higher order smart checks and therefore reuse it, leverage it across many projects? And once you have these higher order things, if you want something specific, think about it as how you would think in terms of object orientation. Do a bit of an inheritance and then specialize it as appropriate. And therefore, we could pave the way for a much richer, leverageable body of test assets and knowledge that we can use across many possible projects and applications. And that is why I think I would prefer the name of smart probes. So in a way, smart probes therefore is just a combination of smart checks and what we know as test cases. So when I started off with the presentation and said smart probes versus test cases, obviously I was trying to tickle your brain, but when you look at it largely, smart probes is a bigger subset of test cases, and test cases ideally form a part of it, whole stuff, right? And I would like to think about the other ones as a smart kind of a check, just to ensure that we understand there are 4 other ways of how we can look at it. So the intention, my objective as part of this musings was to kind of vent a little bit of my frustration with the typical stuff that is practiced in the community as, here are test cases and we do, and whatever we don't have test cases, we do some ad hoc tests, and that is how I ensure my quality is good. And of course, some of these test cases would certainly be automated, and some of them may be run frequently as regression and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter how you qualify those test cases. Could be functional, could be regression, could be non-functional, and so on and so forth. But I think the fact of the matter is that's not enough. And why is it not enough? Because we see a lot more escapes in real life, which more often than not is also due to the fact that I am still inside the box. As much as you like to believe we are employing out of the box, I'm not too sure if we are consistent across the community that we are able to do it, because we are not able to have a certain, what should I say, a method to be able to do it. And to me, one of the ways to do that is smart checks. So that's how I think, and I believe that, the notion and the idea of probes is a little more greater than the notion of test cases and testing. So probing versus testing, if I could put, as I kind of talked about in one of the early webcasts, which is again trying to give the idea that probing gives us a more expansive way of thinking. And by probes, by meaning it's a much more expanded set of assets beyond the test cases. So that's really the whole idea. Of course, probes itself can be generic and specific. And what do? It is not only focused on the doing, they also give you have a notion of, hey, I suggest, and I also ideate. So what does ideate mean? I don't know what to tell you, but maybe you know better, so why don't you help? So if you go to the net and you look for some checklists, and you specifically look for certain checklists, not in software, maybe in aircraft industry, medical industry, and so on, you will find those checklists which have the first 2 parts, which is ideate and suggest. They call it checklist, but if I put checklist here in software context, people will say, oh, I know that, it's nonsense. So I prefer to use the word smart checks, and I also have some articles on those. But those help me to do a better job. So that's what I wanted to muse about, and thank you for patiently listening to this last 30 odd minutes. So the transformation program that we do across at organization level or personal level or whatever, it's not anymore a class. It's actually a coaching program, which is primarily about one of the key facets about this entire program is to help design smart probes and then probe smartly, one of which is what we talked about in this particular webcast. So if you are, if you think that's useful for any of your teammates or colleagues, please do get in touch with us, because I think we will hopefully start one personal cohort, which runs for about 6 weeks sometime in November.